So welcome everyone. We're going to give it a couple of minutes so that people can filter in, and then we will get started. We'll say 12:05 to make it a round number.
You all want me to play some music?
I'm always into that, but I don't know if that has to be a people in control of the webinar thing or not. I don't know how that works. I've never done it.
I play music for my students at the beginning of class.
I think if your sound is on the computer, it should just play. We got some mood music going here.
This song is called "You've Got to Have Freedom" by Pharoah Sanders.
Well, that's appropriate. All right. Thank you for the mood music. And welcome everyone. I'm David Greenwald. I want to welcome everyone to the Vanguard webinar on the human rights disaster at San Quentin. We have had over 120 people sign up for the webinar today. Looking forward to a big audience and a great discussion. So one thing to let everyone know as we go along, if you post your comments or your questions or both into the chat, we will read the questions in the second part and have the panelists respond to them. So we've been covering the hearing at San Quentin over the last several weeks in Marin County. One judge has called it the worst epidemiological disaster in California correctional history. There are more than 300 individuals that have filed habeas corpus petitions alleging that the prison violated Eighth Amendment protections against cruel and unusual punishment. What happened was a transfer occurred last May, and about 121 incarcerated people from CIM in Chico went to San Quentin. At the time, CIM had the highest COVID-19 infection rate of any prison in California. But prior to the transfer, San Quentin didn't have any confirmed cases. They brought the transfers in, they didn't do the testing, and all of a sudden there was an absolute disaster at San Quentin. So before we get into our panel discussion, I want to quickly introduce one of our great interns at the Vanguard, Aparna Komarla, about a year ago, came to me and said, "Hey, I want to start tracking COVID cases in CDCR, in the prisons." And so we sat down and kind of figured out how that would happen. And over the course of the last year, she's led a team of anywhere from 10 to 15 student interns, and they've been tracking not only CDCR, but they're also tracking in about 7 different county jails as well. And, you know, one of the more interesting things is we watched almost in real time as the disaster in San Quentin unfolded. I remember June 11th of last year, we had our first report of cases at San Quentin, and all of a sudden it exploded from there. So I want to introduce Aparna. She's going to talk a little bit about what we're doing, and then we will get into our panel discussion.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, whoever's on the panel. We really appreciate your time. So like David said, I started this project in May of last year. I was not associated with the Vanguard before that. I had this idea to start tracking COVID statistics in county jails and CDCR. And at this point, we're doing a combination of quantitative and qualitative reporting. We have built up a database for CDCR's 35 state prisons, where one can view a time series of all of the cases, testing, vaccinations as well at this point. And we have a
Uh-oh. Sorry, Aparna. I promoted you to panelist and apparently it cut you off.
Oh, no problem.
So now you can turn your video on so people can actually see you. Sorry about that, everyone.
Where was I?
You were just starting with
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so I started this project May of last year. The idea was to track COVID statistics in CDCR's 35 prisons and the county jail system in California. County jails especially, I think, have not been receiving the same amount of attention as the CDCR facilities. So what we're doing is, on one hand, quantitative work, wherein we're building a database of COVID statistics, that's active cases, testing, resolved cases, vaccinations as well, for CDCR, and also around 6 to 7 focused county jail systems in California.
Great. So thanks for sharing that. And oh, and how many interns are working with you right now?
So at this point, I have around 15. It's been a revolving door, so I would say we've had at least 45, 30 to 40 to 45 interns throughout the course of the year come and go.
So thank you for sharing that. They do absolutely outstanding work, and they've gotten quite a bit of notoriety. Professor Avaram, who's on our panel, has cited them in some of her research, and we've also been cited down at the UCLA. What do they call themselves down there? The data center or whatever?
It's the UCLA Law COVID Behind Bars project. So we're a collaborator with them. We've shared our data set for the 6 county jail systems that we focus on with them. So all of our data is available through their central database as well.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us today and sharing a little bit about the project.
Thank you. And I also just want to say, if anybody has the ability to donate, we have an ongoing fundraiser, which Michelle is going to put in the chat. So we're fully funded by donors and subscriptions. So if you do have the ability, we would appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thanks, Aparna. All right, so now I'm going to introduce the panel, and we're really pleased to have this panel here today. You know, one of our partners for the last couple of years has been the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. When we've been able to, we've been running a court watch in conjunction with them in the San Francisco courts. We started that in 2019. Now that COVID has abated somewhat, we feel a little bit more comfortable about sending interns back into the courtroom to do our court coverage. So we'll be actually starting that back up this month with a fresh core of interns. And we have Danica Rodarmo from the Public Defender's Office on our panel. We also have the esteemed Professor Adar Avaram from UC Hastings Law School, and Adamu Chan, who is a former incarcerated individual, has joined us as well. So I'd like for each of you to briefly introduce yourselves, and then I have basically 3 questions that I'm going to throw out there one at a time and kind of do this as more of a discussion. And then as the audience has questions, they're going to post it into the chat. And then Michelle will read those off in the second half, so we can address those as well. So Danica, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. And I just want to start by saying thank you so much for all of the amazing coverage that Davis Vanguard's been doing of these issues and the proceedings in Marin County Superior Court. It's been long and a lot, and I think it would be hard for anybody to track everything that's going on if it wasn't for the work that you are doing. So thank you for that. I'm Danica Rodarmel. I'm the State Policy Director at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office and counsel on the habeas petitions that are currently in the Marin County Superior Court.
All right, and Hadar?
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a joy and an honor to be with you. Your coverage of this has been amazing, and the data collection project is truly wonderful. Also delighted to have Danica and Adamu and many of our friends at the Stop San Quentin Outbreak Coalition listening in, fighting something that I at least think is one of the most serious human rights crimes to have happened in the state. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for caring. I teach at UC Hastings in San Francisco, where I work and write on issues of criminal justice. I have several books out, the latest of which is Yesterday's Monsters, which is a book about the parole process in California. And I'm right now working on a book which is going to come out in 2023 called Fester, about the COVID-19 crisis in California prisons. Happy to be here, and hopefully we can do something together to make things better.
And Adamo.
Yeah, thank you for having me here, David, and great to be here with Danica and Dar, who I also share space with within the Stop San Quentin Outbreak Coalition, and I'm here on behalf of those folks and folks that I was in community with inside. My name is Adamu Chan. I use he, him pronouns, and beyond just being a formerly incarcerated person, like I'm also a filmmaker and artist. And if anyone here has a chance, I just got off the phone with my colleague Edmund, who's currently inside of San Quentin, and on the latest episode of Snap Judgment podcast, me and him co-produced that episode. So please take a listen. But yeah, just some background on me. I was incarcerated in San Quentin during the pandemic, and also was released about 6 months ago. So I'm here to offer that perspective. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, and feel free to post the link to the podcast in the chat, and we'd all like to listen to it, I'm sure. So do that. So thanks everyone for being here. And so my first question, is kind of, what do we know about what went wrong with San Quentin's handling of COVID? I understand, big, broad question that you could talk all day on, but I think it's important to have kind of the background of what went wrong.
Maybe I can start. What went wrong in San Quentin didn't start with the transfer from CIM. It started many, many months and possibly even years before, when we've had extremely overcrowded prisons with abysmal healthcare quality in them. For years, prisons have been plagued with various epidemics. There's been Legionnaire's disease. There's been valley fever ravaging the prisons. And when COVID-19 came on the horizons, many, many public health experts and criminal justice experts said, what we have to do is decarcerate. We have got to reduce the overcrowding. There is an old case from, not that old, from 2011 called Brown versus Plata, which was a case involving the healthcare in prisons in California. And in that case, at that time, the prisons were bloated with people to the tune of twice as many people as the institution is built to hold. And what the federal courts required was that the prison system overall reduce, but not to capacity, but to 137.5% capacity. So even with things the way that they are, the prisons were still massively overcrowded, and some prisons were even more overcrowded than others. San Quentin occupies a special position because it is a very old building. It's a building that exists since the 1850s. I hope, Adamo, you're going to talk a little bit about the construction, because I loved reading your thing about the hospital built on top of the dungeon. It's most of the structures in Quentin still date back to the date of its construction, and it has virtually no ventilation. And so people knew that it was just a matter of time before any infection was going to spread and ravage the prison, and nonetheless, nothing was being done. And inevitably, something went wrong. It is virtually impossible to do a transfer, especially a transfer of this size, in a safe way. And I want to point out that we would not have even known what happened had it not been for the courageous work of a reporting team at the San Francisco Chronicle who broke the story. And later on, there was a report from the Office of the Inspector General reporting on the fact that people were transferred in crowded buses, packed up like sardines. We've heard testimony from people who were on that bus in this hearing. They had been tested for COVID weeks before, but not before they went on the bus. Some people reported symptoms before being put on the bus and were put on the bus anyway. Some people reported symptoms upon arrival to San Quentin. And when they arrived to San Quentin, they were not immediately tested, and they were not isolated from the rest of the prison population. Moreover, another thing that happened was that the prison ostensibly rejected any proposals to help them with testing, with protective equipment, offers that came both from UC Berkeley and from various tech companies, biotech companies around the Bay, said, no, we're going to be fine. And moreover, when the chief health officer of Marin County, Dr. Matthew Willis, wrote to the prison and says, we know about this transfer, please isolate these people before the infection ravages the prison and gets out of the prison into Marin County. And what the prison did, they didn't even respond to his letter. They sent him a copy of a similar letter that was sent to a health officer in Kings County saying, you're a county official, we're a state prison, you have no authority here. And that was that. Of course, the infection spread immediately. If you want to see a map of how the infection spread, you can go to the Office of the Inspector General's website to see the graphic of the infection spreading throughout the prison. More than 75% of the population got sick. Dozens of people died, and the infection then proceeded to other prisons. Efforts to litigate this were successful initially because we got a favorable decision from the Court of Appeal that required San Quentin to reduce its population in accordance with recommendations made by doctors from an organization called Amend SF, which volunteered to visit the prison and make these recommendations. But later on, we had a reversal of fortune in the Supreme Court, and the case is now back at the Marin Superior Court. And that is the hearing that David was referring to at the beginning. And what remains to be seen is what the result is going to be and whether the prison is going to try to shirk any efforts of decarceration by moving people between institutions, which actually, as we've seen, exposes people to even more danger of infection.
All right. Adamo, did you want to kind of talk about it from your perspective?
Sure. I'll try to be quick because I feel like Danica has a lot to say. I see Danica moving around. Yeah. So I think yes to everything that Hadar said, and also just to like expand on what Hadar was saying about the Plata versus Brown case, which essentially, you know, to say that just essentially for over a decade now, the issue of overcrowding and its connection to like premature death inside of the prison system has existed, right? And so like what we're talking about now is in some ways only relevant to folks on the outside because COVID was also something that impacted the broader public, right? But that I think it's important to say that like this has been going on for years. Folks have been dying from numerous outbreaks inside of prisons, not just San Quentin, all over the country, in jails, ICE detention centers, so on and so forth. And in fact, right now inside of San Quentin, there is a norovirus outbreak. And so I think that that's just an important thing to think about, which is that, yeah, prisons have not been safe even before the pandemic. I think the other thing too that I want to remark about was, yes, like we can credit the courage of reporters at the Chronicle for reporting on this stuff, but I also want to highlight the courage of folks who are inside and folks that have been doing media work and have been, you know, putting their own personal safety on the line to report from the inside about what has been going on inside of San Quentin. And I think that, you know, the Chronicle doesn't get their stories unless they have the relationships and connections to folks inside who are putting their own safety on the line. And I think that that was like one thing that was really important during this time, which was, I think that like a lot of us who were inside, you know, were figuring out our relationship to like our own voice and like what we could do collectively to speak out about what was happening. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I want to give Danica a chance to chime in too.
Yeah, that's good. Danica?
Yeah, I like starting at the really high, broad level, right? What happened at San Quentin calls into question the entire structure of our society and how we want to be as a society and how we have traditionally been, how we have thought about responding to harms and how we deal with societal issues. And we're really committed to this like system of punishment and court processes as the way that we hold people accountable, or also like as a system of social control of particular categories of people, mostly poor people and black and brown people, right? And so it really like what we saw was the result of continued dehumanization of people in prison, continued passage of laws and case law in the courts that has only further entrenched the idea that one, people in prison are not deserving in the same way that people outside of prison are of being treated with dignity and like human beings. It also has like really served to continually disempower people inside from trying to protect themselves or enforce their rights, and really try to shield all of that from public view, right? So one of the things that feels really important about all of this work that we're talking about is that we're not turning away, right? A lot of questions are being asked about what we're hoping to accomplish with the case in Marin County Superior Court right now. And honestly, like, it's accountability. It's showing that this mattered, that people are paying attention, and we're not just gonna let it go idly by and act as though somehow people in power don't have to adhere to the same rules that they enforce against other categories of people consistently. So, you know, we can talk about the details of what happened in San Quentin, and it just really, it's a very clear picture of this long-term commitment that we've had to structural racism and oppression of certain types of people, and treating them as not human.
Yeah, and that gets into my second question, which is, you know, what is this hearing about at San Quentin right now? What's the goal here?
Obviously, the goal of the petitioners is to win this finding that says that San Quentin / CDCR violated people's right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. The state wants to prove that they did everything in their power to protect people. But like I said, aside from whether or not we win, just this process matters, right? That we had people inside who testified, who told their story, and people are watching and paying attention. This is a signal that when these kinds of things happen, we will work to hold people accountable, even if there isn't big, like, money damages that we can get, right? People tend to think that the only time people want to do big cases or spend all this time in litigation is when there's like some big reward or payoff. But this shows, like, that doesn't have to be the case, right? We're not doing this for a bunch of money. Nobody involved in this case is doing this case for a bunch of money. This case is about accountability and recognizing that people really were harmed. 28 incarcerated people died. A staff member died. It was truly a hell inside of there for months, and terrifying for everybody who is trapped inside of there, all of their loved ones, and the surrounding communities, and the staff that was going there too. You know, everybody that was involved really was, like, horrified and exposed to a virus that we didn't really understand much at all at that point. And just, it sends a real signal to people that we just don't, people inside, that we really just don't care about them. And I think that that undercuts our larger humanity too. We really are impacted collectively by how we treat people that are, you know, in prisons, that are unsheltered, that are, we subject to so much cruelty all the time. And we act like it doesn't matter, but it does matter. It really harms all of us. And we don't have to do things in that way. And so hopefully through this case, regardless of the outcome, it sends a signal that this matters, we're paying attention, and we will do something. We are going to work to vindicate the dignity and the rights of people.
But Dar, you've been live tweeting good chunks of this. What have we learned so far? Anything that you didn't know?
The facts we pretty much knew, again, because of the excellent reporting, like Adamo said, both inside and on the outside. We are learning a lot of the details, but I think that the most important or the biggest significance for me in listening to the trial is to hear the stories in people's own voices. Just a few days ago, one of the witnesses was talking about how his neighbor died right in front of him, and how the staff dragged this person who was already dead out of the cell by his legs, and was sobbing on the Zoom camera. I think we're in a really interesting moment now, viewing this on Zoom and being able to get people's real, authentic, unmediated voices from the prison telling us what it felt like to be in this truly terrifying environment. So this really stands out to me. Another thing that stands out to me in especially now that I see the proceedings unfold and the objections and all of that stuff, is the enormous amount of legal and logistical energy that the Attorney General's office is putting into fighting this thing. This is especially shocking to me because the Attorney General, Rob Bonta, who was a legislator before he became Attorney General, was with us at San Quentin last summer, standing shoulder to shoulder with me in front of the gate that's right behind you, David, in your Zoom background, saying this is a travesty, we have to hold people accountable. And now that he's Attorney General, essentially his employees are fighting this legal battle to basically shirk responsibility for this human rights crime. This is horrific to me. And it's especially horrific because among the things that are getting exposed at the hearing is this enormous amount of COVID denialism and lack of care and misbehavior that is rampant among the rank and file staff in terms of not wearing PPE, not getting tested, not getting vaccinated. The gap between the rates of vaccination among the incarcerated population and among the staff is astounding. And it persists throughout all the prisons. And the fact that the Attorney General is putting all this effort to fight this rightful finding of what happened here, rather than putting all those legal minds to work thinking about how to mandate the staff to vaccinate, these are state employees. What could be easier, and by the way, it is legal to do this, than to tell people you will get a vaccination against a deadly virus or you have no business working here. You know, so to put the legal energy toward that rather than toward fighting the outcome in this case. So this is another thing that kind of accompanies the whole thing with me. And I'll say one last thing, which is that the other thing that sticks to me is kind of like this basic misunderstanding of how geography and epidemiology work. It's a lot of what we're seeing or experiencing and throughout this hearing and with people being indifferent to what's going on is this idea that the gates of prison are somehow the solid thing and that there's this boundary between the inside and the outside. And anybody who's been inside a prison in whatever function knows that nothing could be farther from the truth. Every day, hundreds of people come in and out of every prison in the world. This is just the nature, you know, it's staff, it's volunteers, it's workers, it's lawyers, it's family members that visit, it's, you know, it's just stuff that gets delivered into the prison. The prison is porous. The virus comes in and out. There's a lot of things that move in and out between a prison. And I think that this idea of deservedness, or kind of like keeping healthcare for the people that supposedly deserve it, it's this zero-sum idea that like somehow, you know, there's only enough health to go around and it's better to give it to those who supposedly deserve it than to those, you know, nothing could be farther than the truth. This has been a point that I've been trying to drive home every time I talk about this, that a 65-year-old man with a bullet in his lung, I happen to describe our petitioner, Ivan von Steich, in the original case, right? A 65-year-old man with a bullet in his lung is much more dangerous to you inside incubating this virus, getting you and yours sick, than they are outside with their families. There's a vast amount of people behind bars, we've seen many of them testify at the hearing, who have long ago aged out of crime and who are suffering from various health problems that stem directly from being in these sick buildings and sick facilities. So this is another thing that stuck with me, is kind of like this misapprehension of how prison works, how viruses work, how geography works.
I just want to follow.
Oh, go ahead.
Hadar's last point about what is happening inside of prisons very clearly leaking out into the rest of the community and not being very visible with the case of COVID is related to what I was saying earlier about the fact that the harm that happens there all the time, the dehumanization that happens there all the time, also seeps out into the rest of community and society. And we just have had a very visual example of that with the virus, but that's happening all the time in a lot of other different ways.
I was just going to emphasize a couple of points that Hadar had made. One, which is the background was actually taken that day that you and Bata and a whole bunch of others spoke at San Quentin. The other is really interesting. I went to another prison last weekend, Mule Creek, and you know, in order for me to go visit, I had to show my vaccination card and then go through a whole bunch of hoops, which is all good. And but you know, it is kind of shocking that you know the incarcerated people have to be vaccinated. I have to be vaccinated, but the staff doesn't. So that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But anyway, just a side note on that. Adamu, what are your thoughts having probably followed this for the last few weeks?
Yeah, thanks, David. Honestly, like I'm gonna be completely honest about this and transparent about this. It's been really difficult for me to tune in to the hearing. And on the first day, hearing some of the testimony, I really just had to turn it off because I mean, the first thing is like I was there and I heard these stories from folks, and there's new stuff that I'm hearing, but also it's difficult for me. It's been very difficult for me. But I think, like, to your point about vaccinations, and then also like the broader point about accountability. I remember back when when I was still inside and we were putting together demands. This was it before the outbreak hit its apex, and folks on the inside were kind of organizing and getting together a list of demands that we were going to present to the governor and also to the prison. And one of them was around the fact that, so the first one was demanding large scale releases. The second was to stop transfers. But like farther down the list was this point about officers being able to work in parts of the prison where infection was rampant, and then working shifts in other parts of the prison where the infection rates were low or non-existent, like H unit where I was at. And I remember specifically there being an officer that worked a shift in East Block and was visibly showing symptoms and came to H unit and was working there and was told to go home because, I mean, first of all, he wasn't wearing his mask. And then second of all, he was showing like symptoms. And so I think like, yeah, I mean, I think that the point that Hadar and both Hadar and Danica are making about accountability is super relevant, because we're talking about a system that purports to do such a great job about holding the folks in, under its quote unquote care, accountable for, things that they've done. And it seems highly hypocritical in this situation when that same system is trying to duck any sort of accountability. Yeah, and so I think that's the point that I would make about that.
And I think, in order to kind of illustrate this, I mean, I remember from last summer, some of the horror stories that came out, even at that point, people being, violently ill and being given 2 Tylenol and told to go back to their cell. People as sick as they've ever been, sleeping head to foot in these cells. I mean, is this willful negligence on the part of staff, or is this something else?
I'll just say, I mean, we haven't talked very much about the call for releases yet. And I mean, we've mentioned releases, we've mentioned overcrowding in the prisons, but that is really like the main point, right? Which is we have a system that is way overcrowded and overburdened, and just like you just truly cannot do anything very well on that kind of scale. You're not nimble. And we really, I mean, CDCR has a $13 billion budget, but we haven't, the point of that system is not really care for people inside, right? And one of the things that has become very clear to me throughout the hearing proceedings is this real difference between the custody staff, the security staff, right, the correctional officers, and the health staff. And that while those two things are supposed to really be equal in power, right, and overpowering each other in different circumstances all the time, it seems pretty clear that, you know, CDCR, even though they've got the R on the name now for rehabilitation, the real purpose is obviously like punishment and security, and that the custody considerations seem to be the ones that constantly win out. So, you know, the just real fact of the matter is there's way too many people in our prisons, and we're not dedicated to ensuring that those people are actually cared for. And that's the culture, right? That's just the whole overall culture of the system. And so whether or not it's like willful negligence on any particular staff's part in any particular situation, overall, the system is just not designed to provide adequate care.
Yeah, one of the recommendations from one of the several of the reports was to reduce the prison size by half, and they haven't even tried to do that.
Yeah, I think this requires a little bit of a conversation about the complicated political paralysis it's sort of at the background of the inability to kind of wrap our minds around the fact that we actually are going to be fine in terms of public safety with a much smaller prison system. And I think San Quentin is an interesting place. I note this also because I've just seen in the chat that somebody was asking, well, what's special about San Quentin? Is it run differently than other places? Well, of course, there's the plant itself. They keep using that term, the plant, in the hearings. There's the infrastructure, but there's also something else. San Quentin is located at the center of a place where there's a lot of do-gooders and a lot of people who are like, it's a densely urban area, and a lot of people who are looking at what's going on in the prison because it's actually close to large centers of fairly liberal and progressive populations. And that means that there's a lot more opportunities in the sense of all kinds of do-gooders and volunteers and people that run programs in and out. And because of that, even though the facility is antiquated and there's lots of problems there, there are a lot of people for whom it's crucially important to be there because of the programming. I don't know if our listeners know this, but generally speaking, in California, there is an astonishing lack of programming. And just to kind of something that you might not know, this is from my book, Yesterday's Monsters, parole boards regularly require people to attend programs that simply do not exist or that are not accessible to them. It's that Kafkaesque. And that means that a lot of people, even though they were facing this huge risk, transferring out of there somewhere else was even worse for them because they would lose the opportunity to participate in programs that are required for people to actually be successful in their parole bid, right? The other aspect of this, and this goes to what Danica was just talking about, is the fact that San Quentin tends to have a somewhat older population than other prisons, and it has a population of people who are doing considerably longer stretches of time. So people that are doing, and obviously, you know, in a determinate sentencing system and in a system with life sentences, people do longer stretches for more serious crimes. One of the things that has characterized our sort of recession era effort toward criminal justice reform was focusing only on so-called nonviolent crimes, kind of like with the idea, which by the way is empirically mistaken, that people who are doing time for nonviolent offenses are less dangerous or less risky or less likely to reoffend than people doing time for serious offenses. The truth is that this is just incorrect. Usually people who have done long stretches of time in prison have aged out of crime. This is something that we've known for decades, that people age out of crime in their mid to late 20s. They do not come back to doing crime. And in fact, when I was doing work on parole for my book, parole officers said that they love working with the lifer population because they don't give them any grief. Because they're mature people who are leaders and mentors on the yard. They go out and they become leaders and mentors in their community, and they don't actually pose a risk to public safety. But there's this misguided idea that, oh, what are we going to do and how are we going to deal with the public backlash if we let these people go out? I've seen some newspaper headlines, I'm sure you guys have seen them too, just in the course of it, you know, Newsom considering releasing, you know, dangerous criminals. And of course, there's always this fear of political backlash. I also want to point out that as we've seen recently, crime rates, generally speaking, are up nationwide. Doesn't matter, progressive cities, conservative cities, just crime is up. Why is crime up? Because we're reopening after a pandemic and patterns of crime respond to that sort of thing. And my thinking, my speculation is that there's concern that somebody's going to tie that to releases. There is no causal relationship whatsoever or any correlation. And there's going to be political backlash for that. And that's what's kind of keeping us in this mentality of we absolutely must keep these people locked up. When again, when we're talking about aging and infirm people, this is about a third of the California prison population. You and yours, I'm talking to the people on the outside, are much safer with these folks out in their communities, living quietly in peace than you are at them incubating a disease behind bars.
Great. Well, there we go. So yeah, thanks. So any other thoughts? Otherwise, I want to start getting into some of the audience questions. All right. Michelle, do you want to read an audience question?
Sure. So the first question is, can the, and this is for all the panelists, can the panelists post their social media links? And Adam, can you post a personal/professional social media account where we can follow your creative work?
And while they're doing that, why don't you go to the next question? Michelle?
Hi, yes. So the next question is there any news about the rollout of the new elderly parole parameters for early releases?
I can speak to that if none of the others want to. We are making progress with elderly parole, but not enough. We're pressing on several points that have to do with parole. I'm actually testifying before the legislature next week on a proposition to diversify the parole board to include more therapy people, because right now everybody who's on the parole board, virtually everyone, is from a law enforcement background. So we're working on that. So there are some avenues of release that are opening up, but a lot of this is discretionary. And it's a lot of this is a question of goodwill. One of the things that we saw is that when they were trying to interpret kind of the release categories, because there was so much talk in the summer that people were actually going to be let out, we thought that they were going to let out the obvious folks, the folks that are aging and the folks that have various health conditions. So the Chronicle finally found out in November what the breakdown was of the 8,000 people that were released. Never mind that that's just a drop in the bucket in terms of the numbers, but it turned out that 99.2% of the people that got released were folks that were going to get out anyway in just a few short months. So they basically just gave a little push out the door for the people that were on the verge of release, and only 0.8 of the releases were people who actually had health problems that were COVID risks. So this, of course, is a source of concern. I mean, I should say, everybody who's in this big habeas case that we've been talking about come from various backgrounds, very different backgrounds. Some people are younger, some people are older, some people have health conditions, some people don't. People are doing, a variety of amounts of time. And of course, nobody has kind of like a bigger claim that, that CDCR owes them their health and safety than somebody else. CDCR has to take care of everybody who is in their care. But it is very evident from just looking at the numbers that they just said, we're just not going to let out anybody who's doing time for so-called violent crime. And of course, that tended to include folks that are older and sicker. And this is precisely why we have to continue pressing on this point of medical parole.
Yeah, and I want to reemphasize the point that was made earlier, which is that, what the research has shown is that after a certain point, people really age out of crime. And so, if you're looking at people who are over the age of, 50 or even older, the chance of them committing a new crime at this point is very low, but there's this stigma attached to them. So people get up in arms. Oh, you're releasing a violent criminal. Oh, yeah, maybe 30 years ago, they committed a violent act, but they're probably not any more of a threat than anyone else is at this point.
Can I make a point or just a little pushback on that point too? Like, I think that, you know, like as a political statement, like I've heard this like voiced before, and I think that it can be helpful in certain situations to think about like how people age out of quote unquote crime. But I think that like another thing to think about too is just that, you know, when we think about the reasons why people harm other people, thinking about like the relationship between like, and I think that this is something that people have kind of become more aware of over the last year, and this is also like related to things that have been happening outside of prisons in relationship to like police, and thinking about like, or redefining like what violence is, right? And that like people think about violence as like interpersonal violence, right, between two people, but also thinking about the ways in which like violence happens at a systemic level, right? And that from my experience, and I'll speak about my experience, everyone that I was in community with inside of prison, that I was incarcerated with, had some type of history of abuse that was committed against them, right? Before they ever were categorized as a violent person or committed a act of harm against another person, they had experienced some harm themselves, right? And that could have happened interpersonally or at the hands of the foster care system, the educational system, and so on and so forth. And so I think that like to understand that like those things, but also to understand that like, you know, poverty and lack of healthcare are also like forms of violence too. And that when people have harmed other people, it has come in response to harm that has been committed against them. And so I think that that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, but I think that that's something also to understand. And I think that like there's a joke amongst community inside of San Quentin that San Quentin is actually the safest place in Marin. And I don't want to erase the violence that happens against incarcerated people there, you know, by being locked in cells and by being strip searched and all that. But I know that like in that community, there is little to no violence that happens interpersonally between members of the incarcerated community. There's a high level of accountability in that community. And so I think that that's something to think about. And it's also something to think about the fact that like, do prisons and, you know, our systems of policing do what they purport to do, right? Do they actually keep us safer, right? Are we actually, like when we're in these conversations about like who should and shouldn't be getting out of prison, are we actually talking about safety or are we talking about something else? Yeah, that's what I would say about that. I think Danica had something.
I just want to add on, you know, that, yeah, the focus on who is in prison and what's going to happen when they come home does kind of take away from us shifting the focus to why did they cause harm that brought them there? What happened to whoever was harmed by that? And are we actually taking adequate care of them? What, you know, and to the point about many people who cause harm or commit violence were victims of that kind of harm and violence themselves before. And the truth of the matter is, and it just blows people's minds when you say this to them, but it's just true that like what we have right now as a system of accountability and punishment is only one option, only one possibility for how we handle those things. And they are like true, just like human realities, right? Humans cause harm, humans do violence, but we have so many other ways that we could think about how to respond to that and how to deal with that in our societies, but we're so committed to like just this one, and this is the only one we've ever like thought about in this country, and we just want to keep dumping money into it, even though it shows us time and time again that it doesn't work. And it just, I challenge people to be more creative. We made this. It wasn't the only thing we could have made, and we can make something different. And I think, it just depends on what our goals are, though. And I think many people would argue that the system that we currently have is serving the goals of the people who created it. But many of us want something else and have different goals. And so we're pushing to create something different.
Very good. Michelle, did you have another question?
Yes. So someone asked if the panelists can talk a little bit more about the fact that incarcerated people are testifying via Zoom and also watching proceedings inside. Are they facing risk of backlash doing that?
I'll take this one. Life for incarcerated people is constantly dangerous, and people are targeted for all kinds of different reasons. I think it's important to note that we really allowed people to make a choice about whether or not they wanted to be a part of the case, right? People have withdrawn their petitions out of fear of retaliation. And people have, expressed various levels of concern about testifying or being involved. And so always, I think we are very committed on the legal team of trying to ensure that whatever we're doing is really guided by what the folks inside feel comfortable with, are asking for, are wanting to the best of our ability. And I'm sure Adamo has something to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always this threat of retaliation for anything. And anytime anyone is speaking up about anything, there's always a threat of retaliation. And I think that part of, why these abuses like thrive in the system is because is based in a great degree, or in a large part, by the existence of like people's like silence, right? And their fear of retaliation. And so I think that that is always something that folks need to consider, especially folks that are serving life terms and have to go to the parole board and have to deal with questions about like, were you organizing inside? Were you know what I mean? But I think that I also feel like folks have recognized the urgency of this moment, and that the alternative to not speaking out means that like a lot of folks died, and a lot of folks got serious debilitating health effects. And so yeah, I just want to say that like that's always a concern, but it's something that I feel like something shifted.
Just a couple of words on this. I think that this whole process was marred with retaliation from the very beginning. When we got the decision from the Court of Appeal in October that Quentin had to shrink to 50% of design capacity, the court shied away from saying, and you have to do this by releases. So they basically left the option of doing it by releases or by transfers to the prison. And of course, the prison authorities immediately went to transfers, which, seemingly it's like, well, what do you want? The court gave us the option, but it is retaliatory because that the experience of being at San Quentin is very complicated. On one hand, there's this facility problem and the disease, and on the other hand, there's loss of programs, there's possible animosities, there's all kinds of issues with prison politics. So kind of just doing that in itself sheds this kind of retaliatory shadow over the whole process. I think that people testifying from the inside are incredibly brave. I am noting just kind of stylistically, one thing that I've noticed is that when the attorney general lawyers are cross-examining incarcerated witnesses, they have systematically started off every cross-examination by asking the person their inmate number. This serves no reason, like there's no confusion here. People are easily identified. The only reason they do this is to humiliate and to dehumanize and to remind people that they're incarcerated. I mean, I can't think of any other reason why they do it, and they've been doing it systematically throughout the whole hearing. So there's this kind of retaliatory, undertone to the whole situation, I think. And it's notable, and I'm building on what Adamo has just said, it's notable that despite this risk, things had just gotten to be so bad that people have come to the conclusion that it must come to light and that they have nothing left to lose really from speaking out against what happened. It's extremely powerful to hear these testimonies from the inside. And to that extent, I mean, I know we're all tired of Zoom. To that extent, I'm buoyed by the fact that I can see this trial on Zoom and that a person from inside is speaking to me through the screen, telling me things as they are inside the prison. That I found incredibly powerful. I wish the judge had allowed cameras in, because really watching this hearing is worth 1,000 words.
Those in the audience, feel free to post your questions into the chat. Michelle, do you have another question?
Yes. Can you address the dynamics of dual loyalty amongst prison/jail medical staff?
You're muted.
I'm not sure if I completely understand this question, but maybe it means loyalty to the Hippocratic Oath and loyalty to the system. Is that, I don't know, maybe I'm not understanding this correctly. I think that, like, just to go back to I think what Danica was saying earlier, which is that like when we think about like lack of accountability at a systemic level, that like we're not talking about loyalty to both the patient and the system. Okay. So that, like, we're not talking about like individual COs that that are making bad decisions, but that like accountability at a systemic level results in these outcomes, right? And I think that it's important to talk about that within this context too, with medical staff, which is that that I think most of medical staff that work at San Quentin are not the doctors. They're, people who are also trying to earn a living. And so I just think that like the system moves in ways in which like people, it creates situations where people have to move in mass and move in line with what's coming from up top. And so I think that there were a lot of medical staff while I was inside that were frustrated with what was happening, but not feeling empowered to speak out or make decisions that would, transform this situation. And so I think that that's the issue with the way that systems work, right? Is that individual agency, systems function in ways where individual agency is not like prioritized. And so I think that that's true in this situation as well. I don't know what every single medical staff person's personal view on it is, but I know that they have to move in the ways in which those who are above them tell them to move.
I'm gonna bring in one of our board members, Robert Canning, who was he's retired now, but he was a psychologist at CDCR, and he can address this question. So, Robert? Robert? Well, okay. I guess that's not working. All right. Well, Robert, if you can hear us and, oh, there he goes. We can't hear you though. Robert, we can't hear you. You're not muted. No. Oh,
There you go. How about that?
yeah, there we go.
Great. Sorry. Thanks very much. And Adamo, I really want to, I love the way you parse it as an individual agency. I think that really captures a lot of what staff members feel like. And it is difficult. I worked in institutions and also at headquarters for a long time. And the pressures are real. The stories about who's in control in the prison and the balance of power between custody and healthcare over the 20 years, I think, has shifted. I think to put it in terms of agency, I think people in healthcare have more authority these days. Whether they choose to use it or not is a different matter. And I think that it's shifted some in 20 years, in part because of the Coleman case and because of Plata, and that's been an ongoing thing. I think that having made complaints about staff, at times it's very, very difficult because this retaliation, even against healthcare staff, is very, very real. It can impact people's lives. It can impact their ability to do their work. And it is very real for healthcare staff, although I think that the COVID has really challenged people because healthcare staff have gotten sick too. And it's been very difficult to watch people not obey the rules, not do things that are in the best interest of both incarcerated persons and free staff. It's been very difficult, I think, for a lot of people. And also people haven't been able to get in there to see people. In mental health, the best work is done in person. And when you can't get in there to see someone, you can't talk to them, or you're only limited to seeing them at the cell front, which is very difficult. It's very frustrating for healthcare staff. And I think people have been very challenged in the last year in particular. So I'm not sure I completely answered that. It's always been a struggle to do good mental health care in prisons because they're not built for that. I think Hadar, you mentioned that early on, but they're not places where treatment happens, and they are coercive places, coercive towards staff. I've been coerced by staff, both healthcare and custody, but certainly among the incarcerated population themselves, the individuals who have to live there on a 24-hour basis. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm
Thanks,
really
Robert.
glad that you chimed in, Robert, because you reminded me that one of the things that I think got exposed at the hearings was the fact that, I don't know if people know, I assume many of our viewers and listeners know this, but part of the constant litigation about, so-called healthcare in prisons meant that the healthcare was actually taken out of the hands of CDCR and given to a federal receiver. And that means that when you're inside and you really don't have a choice or, dominion over your own healthcare, you're kind of subjected to two masters, right? You're subjected to the state in the form of CDCR, and you're subjected to the federal receiver and the health services. And at least from the cross-examination that Charles Carbone did of Warden Broomfield, I got the sense that they themselves are not entirely clear on how the decision tree needs to work. And one of the notable things at the hearing was that we did hear from some of the physicians. I think it's extremely brave on the part of a San Quentin physician to testify at a hearing like this. You know, obviously the bravest folks are the incarcerated people themselves, who can receive an enormous amount of retaliation. But, you know, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing San Quentin physicians who have been quietly struggling against the system for months, trying to give people better care, trying to collaborate with the lawyers working for the incarcerated people, and not being successful because of the command tree and because of the way that it works. And I'm also seeing, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong, those of you who have been following the hearing, I'm noticing a little bit of sort of mudslinging between CDCR and CCHCS as to whose responsibility it is, what happened here. So I'm seeing the custodial staff kind of blaming some of this on the healthcare stuff, the healthcare staff blaming some of this on the custodial stuff. And the bottom line is that when, you know, where you're actually looking for somebody to take responsibility to fix this, there's nobody left standing as a consequence of this kind of complicated hierarchy tree.
All right, I want to take a few more questions, Michelle. Thanks, Robert.
Okay. So the next question is, are they receiving rehabilitation while in prison? And I think that question is directed to Danica.
I think Adamo is probably a more appropriate person to answer this. But again, it goes back to like, it's a larger question in my mind, right? About people needing to be quote unquote rehabilitated, or did they actually just need care up front to begin with, and whatever harm was caused could have just been prevented, right? Instead of doing preventative measures, we are so focused on just reacting and responding after disaster strikes. That's how we handle most things in society. It's a complicated word. It's a complicated issue. Programming in prisons is complicated, I think, in a lot of different ways. I mean, a lot of this gets at some things about prison are not complicated, right? Like to me, it's very clear that it's a failed idea. We should get rid of them and we should do something entirely different. But so much of the rest is really complicated. It's complicated to try to care for people inside and to help folks inside, right? I feel like all of our efforts, there's been a bunch of questions in the chat about if San Quentin is ordered to reduce its population, will people be transferred out and then not have access to programs? One of the things that I have seen to be universally true, I feel like, in anything around trying to fix stuff within the prison system, we can't fix it. It's so broken that anytime you try to do a tweak, somebody loses. Anytime you try to help one category of people, somebody loses. Is that a reason not to try to do something? I don't think so. Clearly, I'm standing here in a role of a person trying to do something. But in my mind, we need something just completely different. And the whole concept of rehabilitative programming and prison in general is just not solving anything. But Adamu, what do you think?
Yeah, I think yes to all that. And also, I think I want to make a point about when we're talking about releases, and I think the conversation around release, I think Hadar had references earlier, always kind of revolves back to like the crime that the person committed. And many times, that event happened decades before, right? But at the same time, the Department of Corrections has put rehabilitation in its name. And so as part of its mission is quote unquote rehabilitation, but yet when we're talking about like who should and shouldn't be released, the argument is made that like this person was responsible for this thing that happened decades ago, and so they should not be released. but at the same time, you are putting forward a narrative that says that you rehabilitate. And so which is it, right? Is it, right, that you are rehabilitating folks, or is it that like this person did this decades ago and like we should not release them based on that? And I think the other point that I would make too is just that, like Danica said, it is a very complicated conversation. I think that what I witnessed is that there are a lot of programs inside of San Quentin and other prisons too. And there are programs that are facilitated by the system itself and funded and whatnot. I also think that like there are things that folks do and work that folks do that is not necessarily like validated or recognized by the system as rehabilitative work. But I know folks on the inside that have taught me so much about accountability and about like how to show up, you know, in community and in relationships, and folks that have started their own programs, folks that have done so much to kind of find solutions to violence and find solutions to solving the problems that happen when people relate to each other socially. And so those things would, I think would never like in this conversation of rehabilitation, like be spoken about or validated, but those are things that happen, and those are things that exist. So I think that like this conversation around rehabilitation needs to be broadened, because I think it is a conversation about that gets back to kind of who should and shouldn't be able to be released, and it's not the conversation doesn't capture that accurately.
All right. Any other thoughts on that, or we can press on? Michelle, do we have more questions?
Yes. So the next question is, both San Quentin and Folsom State Prison are similarly situated and old age facilities with poor air ventilation. How can San Quentin's habeas corpus petition extend help to the similar struggles to those inside Folsom State Prison, which they're facing?
Yeah, I tried to recognize in the chat too, just that while we're focused on San Quentin here, there have been massive outbreaks and massive suffering in prisons across the state, the country, the world. San Quentin gets a lot of attention because of its location, and that lots of people have a lot of contact with the place, and so it tends to suck up a lot of the attention. But there is a lot of suffering happening in the rest of the state. And there's been a lot of habeas petition filing in the rest of the state too. The simplest answer to that question is just due to legal rules about what courts can consider what incarcerated people's petitions and cases. The Marin County Superior Court and the case happening there can only handle the petitions of people who filed them while incarcerated in San Quentin. So I think people at Folsom, and honestly, probably every prison in the state, there's been people who have filed petitions on their own behalf, had lawyers file them on their behalves. And it's just a matter of, justice by geography, basically. The right judge, the right access to legal assistance in different areas. It's just consolidated more in these urban areas than it is in some of the more rural prisons that have, communities with less resources, less lawyers, less attention. And I don't know. I think some of those cases, some of the habeas petitions filed in other places are moving forward, some, but none have progressed as much as this one. And San Quentin was the worst outbreak. I think it's still considered to be the worst outbreak in the country, right? And so, no, Hadar's telling me no. We're number 3 now. Okay, well.
Number 2 and 1 are also California prisons.
Right. So very much up there, right? And what happened there was such a clear disaster that it is, some of the arguments that we're making on like legal standard purposes, I think everybody's watching to see what will happen there. If we are successful, it will provide more help in some of those other habeas cases in other areas. And if we aren't, it will kind of probably be perceived as, if you can't prove it there, can you prove it anywhere? And I'm not going to say it doesn't mean you can, but I think that will be one of the ways that it's looked at and thought about, probably.
So we got about 9 minutes left. What are we hoping will come out of all of this? I know I kind of asked this before, but I think we need to cycle back to that. Is this really just about accountability? Are we hoping that it leads to policy changes? Are we hoping that it leads to conditions changes? All of the above? And also, what's the mechanism for doing that? Does the court issue a ruling on this, a finding? How does that work?
Yeah, I'll go first, but I'll be brief because I'm interested in hearing what other people have to say. I think everybody can answer this question differently in terms of what we're hoping to accomplish and how the decision here will be viewed. And I honestly also think that into the future, we'll look back and see it, what the impact ultimately was. I think it might be many years before we know what the real impact of this situation, the catastrophe of the case will unfold for a long time. We are looking for a finding that people in San Quentin rights to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, a constitutional right, were violated. We are looking for the judge to make a ruling that there is an 8th Amendment violation there. What happens after that? This is Hadar can probably speak more to this than me, but an unusual case. There's not a real great rule book for this, or like what happens after this. So right now we're focused on that part of this hearing, and then we'll find out, if that ruling is made, what kind of relief might be ordered, et cetera. But for now, we're looking for that. And in my mind, if we get that, then yes, I think that can be used in a lot of other efforts to move us towards something different, like I've talked about throughout this day, right? That it can help us to continue to decarcerate and dismantle this current system so we can build something that actually creates healing and wellness and wholeness and is like a real response to harm and how we hold people accountable, not this process. So that's my hope and my goal. But like also for sure, if we get that ruling, I would love, I want to see us get relief for people who are inside some sort of, it's complicated what that looks like. And many people inside have different opinions and desires about what that would look like, but granting people relief out of a recognition that their constitutional rights were violated is an important goal.
Thank you. Who wanted to go ahead? Adar?
Oh, go ahead, Adar.
Adamo?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think Danica alluded to this. I think that it's important I think first of all, like I have some reservations about asking the court system to, you know, grant justice in this situation, or the court's capacity to grant justice in this situation. But I think it's important, I think Danica alluded to this, to document and remember what's happened, and have a historical document. And I think that it's not just in this situation, but also through the media and through art and through you know, acts of remembrance, and that people remember what's happened, and that in that remembrance, also remembering that this situation is still ongoing. And so I think that that's a very important aspect of this case specifically. I think the other thing that is my hope, but also something that's also come to fruition, and I talked about this earlier, is that I think that there is something that has shifted in terms of like folks on the inside, loved ones on the outside, and advocates and people who work in this space, with thinking about how to hold the system accountable and how to speak out in times of urgency, which is anytime while prisons exist, I should say, that this is not just a moment, this is like something that is ongoing and is continuing to happen in real time. So I think that those things are things that I have hopes for, and I think things that have also in some ways played out already.
And Hadar?
So the actual remedy issue is going to be pretty sticky. And the reason for that is that this is not a damages lawsuit. It's a habeas petition. And typically the relief that people ask for, habeas corpus in Latin means bring forth the body. It means I am unlawfully locked up, I'm unlawfully incarcerated, I would like to be released. So typically the relief is to be released. And what we're seeing in this hearing is that the Attorney General is holding fast to their position that you can only grant this kind of relief on the basis of hardship that is ongoing, rather than on things that have happened in the past. And because of that, in all these cross-examinations, you're seeing popping up these, oh, but things are better now, but you're vaccinated now, but you're not acquainted anymore, kind of to show that the remedy is no longer necessary. And I think on the other hand, the petitioners are trying to marshal forward the idea that, yes, we've had an abatement of the virus, but it's not because CDCR won its battle against the virus. It's because the virus won. And the virus can win again because the floodgates are open again. There's people coming in to the tune of hundreds of people into prisons from jails every week. We know because we're doing the counts every week. So the concern that something like this can happen, and in fact, there is an active, serious, major outbreak right now in Solano, is very much a palpable thing. And if it's not going to be this one, it's going to be the next one. Because if we continue locking up people to the tune of tens of thousands and sometimes, you know, six-figure numbers of people locked behind bars in the state, we're going to continue seeing the natural medical outcomes of that. With this kind of stickiness of the actual remedy in mind, I want to join what Danica and Adamu both said about the importance of just having a remembrance of what has happened here. And I really wanted to share with you a poem written by Jewish poet Abram Shlonsky, who wrote this poem after World War II, after the Holocaust. And I keep thinking back to it every time I watch these hearings. Every morning I think about this poem when I listen to the testimonies. So this is my English translation. It's not as good as the original Hebrew. By accord with my eyes, which witnessed bereavement, piling their cries on my burdened, bowed heart, by account with my pity, which taught to forgive, till days came that found my compassion unmet. I took on the vow to remember it all, to remember and not to forget. Not a thing to forget till 10th generation, till insult assuages, till all my morality whips are consumed. Damned if in vain the rage night is unwound. Damned if by sunrise my sins I resume and learn nothing again this time around.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, I think that is the note that we should end this on, because I cannot do better than that. So I want to thank our audience for coming and engaging with us. And thank you very much to our three panelists for taking time out of their busy day. And I think the one group of people that we didn't recognize are the attorneys that are fighting this, because they're not getting paid to do this either. So I think they should be recognized. Danica, are you able to share the names? Or am I putting you on the spot?
I mean, there's a lot. It's a very big legal team.
Okay.
And we are getting paid, it's our job. We get paid for our job. It's not like a damages
Right.
case. I just wanted to be clear about that. But yeah, so we've got people from the Marin County Public Defender's Office, Kecker, Van Nest, and Peters, people from FDAP, it's a very big legal team. So I could pull up the complaint and read the names, but it would take a long time. But we have a lot of information on our website, the San Francisco Public Defender's website, that has legal filings, and you can find more information, press releases that have quotes from the legal team and lists everybody who's involved there.
Great. Thank you very much. And everyone have a good and safe weekend.